The morning mist clung to Charleston Harbor like a shroud of impending doom, and Major Robert Anderson stood atop the ramparts of Fort Sumter, watching Confederate batteries being positioned on the surrounding shores. It was April 10th, 1861, and the tension in the air was so thick it could be cut with a bayonet. Anderson knew that within hours, the first shots of what would become America's bloodiest conflict would echo across these waters. Fort Sumter sat like a defiant, stone sentinel in the middle of Charleston Harbor, its pentagonal walls rising 40 feet above the tide. Built to protect Charleston from foreign invasion, it now found itself at the epicenter of a domestic crisis that threatened to tear the nation apart. The fort's strategic position commanded the entrance to one of the South's most important ports, making it a prize neither side could afford to lose. Major Anderson, a career soldier from Kentucky, had moved his small garrison of fewer than 90 men from the more vulnerable Fort Moultrie to Sumter under cover of darkness on December 26, 1860. This decision, made without explicit orders from Washington, had infuriated South Carolina officials who considered it an act of aggression. The state had already seceded from the Union on December 20, 1860, and viewed any federal military presence as an occupation force. The fort itself was far from complete. Its planned armament of 140 guns had never been fully installed, and many of the cannon positions remained empty. The garrison's supplies were running dangerously low, and Anderson's men had been reduced to eating salt pork and hardtack. Yet the major refused to surrender, understanding that Fort Sumter had become more than a military installation. It had become a symbol of federal authority in a region that no longer recognized that authority. As reported by the Charleston Mercury, during this period, tensions had been escalating for months as Confederate forces strengthened their positions around the harbor. General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, the Confederate commander overseeing Charleston's defenses, had been methodically placing artillery batteries on Morris Island, Sullivan's Island, and the mainland, creating a ring of fire around the isolated fort. President Abraham Lincoln faced an impossible dilemma. Reinforcing Fort Sumter might provoke the very war he hoped to avoid, but abandoning it would signal weakness and potentially encourage other states to secede. His predecessor, James Buchanan, had attempted to send supplies and reinforcements aboard the merchant vessel Star of the West in January, but Confederate batteries had fired upon the ship, forcing it to turn back. Lincoln's cabinet was divided, with some members advocating evacuation and others demanding the fort be held at all costs. The situation grew more precarious with each passing day. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, headquartered in Montgomery, Alabama, had authorized Beauregard to demand the fort's surrender, and if refused, to take it by force. The die was cast, and both sides understood that the next move would determine whether this crisis could be resolved peacefully or would explode into open warfare. In the gathering twilight of April 10, 1861, Major Anderson received word that Confederate forces would likely demand his surrender within days. As he gazed across the harbor at the enemy positions, he knew that his small garrison would soon face a bombardment that would change the course of American history forever. The sun had barely crested the horizon on April 11, 1861, when 3 Confederate officers approached Fort Sumter under a flag of truce. Colonel James Chestnut, Jr., Captain Stephen Dill Lee, and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Robert Chisholm had been dispatched by General Beauregard to deliver what everyone knew would be the final ultimatum. Their small boat cut through the choppy waters of Charleston Harbor, while thousands of spectators gathered on rooftops and balconies throughout the city. Sensing that history was about to unfold before their eyes, Major Anderson received the Confederate delegation in his quarters, a sparse room that reflected the garrison's austere conditions. The formal surrender demand was brief and direct: evacuate Fort Sumter immediately, or face the consequences. Anderson, his weathered face betraying no emotion, requested time to consider the proposal and consult with his officers. The Confederates agreed to return at 6 o'clock that evening for his answer. As the delegation departed, Anderson called together his senior officers, Captain Abner Doubleday, Lieutenant Norman Hall, and Lieutenant Jefferson Columbus Davis, the Irony was not lost on them that Davis shared a name with the Confederate president. These men had served together through countless campaigns, and each understood the gravity of their situation. They were heavily outnumbered, undersupplied, and surrounded by enemy forces that had spent months preparing for this moment. Captain Doubleday, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, argued forcefully for resistance. "We cannot surrender this. Post without a fight," he declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the fort's interior. "To do so would be to abandon our oath and our duty to the Union." Lieutenant Hall nodded in agreement, though he quietly calculated their chances of survival against the Confederate batteries that now ringed the harbor. The hours passed slowly as Anderson wrestled with his decision. He walked the fort's perimeter, examining their defenses and considering their options. The garrison had only 48 serviceable cannons, far fewer than the Confederate forces arrayed against them. Their food supplies would last perhaps a week, and their ammunition was limited. More troubling still, many of the fort's gun crews consisted of skilled artillerymen who had been forced to double as infantry, engineers, and even cooks. As evening approached, spectators throughout Charleston gathered to witness what many believed would be the peaceful surrender of the Federal garrison. According to contemporary accounts from the Charleston Courier, crowds lined the waterfront, and many prominent citizens had taken positions on their rooftops with spyglasses to observe the proceedings. The atmosphere was festive, with many Southerners convinced that Anderson would see reason and avoid unnecessary bloodshed. At precisely 6 o'clock, the Confederate delegation returned. Anderson met them at the fort's main gate. His decision made in measured tones, he informed the officers that he could not comply with their demand. However, he added with grim humor, "I will await the first shot, and if you do not batter us to pieces, we shall be starved out in a few days anyway." Colonel Chestnut, who had known Anderson before the crisis, seemed genuinely saddened by his friend's response. The colonel conferred briefly with his colleagues before delivering a final message. If Anderson would commit to evacuating the fort by a specific date, provided he received no additional supplies or reinforcements, the Confederates would withhold their attack. Anderson requested until noon on April 15, 1861, but the delegation could only authorize evacuation by April 14th. The negotiations continued past midnight, with both sides seeking some face-saving compromise that might avoid the coming battle. But as the clock struck 3:30 on the morning of April 12, 1861, it became clear that no accommodation could be reached. Colonel Chestnut delivered the final Confederate message. Bombardment would commence in 1 hour. As the Confederate boat disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, Major Anderson gathered his men in the fort's central courtyard. The flickering torchlight cast long shadows on their faces as he informed them of what lay ahead. These soldiers, many of them far from home, would soon face a test that would determine not only their own fate, but the future of their divided nation. At exactly 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, the thunderous roar of a mortar shell shattered the pre-dawn silence over Charleston Harbor. The projectile, fired from Fort Johnson on James Island, traced a graceful arc through the gray sky before exploding directly over Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun, and Captain George Slocum James, a Confederate artillery officer, had fired the shot that would be remembered as the opening salvo of America's bloodiest conflict. The bombardment that followed was unlike anything the residents of Charleston had ever witnessed. Within minutes of the first shot, Confederate batteries from 4 different positions began a coordinated assault on the isolated Federal garrison, Morris Island, Sullivan's Island, Fort Johnson, and the floating battery anchored off Sullivan's Island all opened fire simultaneously, creating a deadly crossfire that left Fort Sumter's defenders with nowhere to hide. Major Anderson had positioned his men at their battle stations hours before the attack began. The fort's casemates, designed to protect the garrison from incoming fire, proved their worth as Confederate shells crashed against the thick masonry walls. The sound was deafening, a constant percussion of explosions, falling masonry, and the sharp crack of rifled cannon. Smoke filled the air, making it difficult to see or breathe. while the acrid smell of gunpowder permeated every corner of the fort. Captain Abner Doubleday had the distinction of firing the first Union shot in response to the Confederate bombardment at approximately 7 o'clock that morning. He aimed a 32-pound cannon at the iron battery on Cummings Point and pulled the lanyard. The ball struck the battery's iron shield with a resounding clang, but caused no significant damage. The honor of opening the ball in the great drama of the war belongs to South Carolina, Doubleday would later write, but the honor of firing the first shot in defense of the flag belongs to the North. The Confederate gunners had trained for months for this moment, and their accuracy was remarkable. General Beauregard had positioned approximately 47 cannons and 13 mortars around the harbor, creating overlapping fields of fire that made it nearly impossible for the Union garrison to return effective fire. The Confederate batteries on Morris Island, commanded by Colonel Roswell Sabine Ripley, proved particularly effective, with their rifled cannons able to penetrate the fort's brick walls at long range. As reported in Harper's Weekly during this period, the bombardment created a spectacle that drew thousands of spectators to Charleston's waterfront. Citizens gathered on rooftops, balconies, and wharves to witness what many believed would be a brief demonstration of Southern resolve. Ladies in their finest dresses brought picnic baskets, while gentlemen passed around spyglasses and offered commentary on the accuracy of the Confederate gunners inside Fort Sumter. The situation grew increasingly desperate as the hours passed. The garrison's return fire was limited by both ammunition shortages and the superior positioning of the Confederate batteries. Many of the fort's cannons were mounted on the upper ramparts, leaving the gun crews exposed to enemy fire. Anderson made the difficult decision to withdraw most of his men to the lower casemates, effectively reducing his ability to respond to the bombardment. The Confederate shells fell with metronomic regularity, approximately one every minute throughout the morning. The fort's flagstaff was struck multiple times, and each time it fell, brave soldiers would race out under fire to raise the stars and stripes again. The sight of the flag being restored repeatedly drew cheers from spectators in Charleston, who had begun to develop a grudging respect for the garrison's courage. By noon, the bombardment had been continuous for over 7 hours, and the structural damage to Fort Sumter was becoming severe. The officers' quarters had been destroyed, the main gate was blocked by debris, and several of the fort's guns had been disabled by direct hits. Yet remarkably, not a single member of the garrison had been killed or seriously wounded. The Confederate gunners, despite their accuracy, seemed to be firing mainly at the fort's walls rather than deliberately targeting the gun crews. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that this would not be the quick resolution that many had anticipated. The bombardment continued with unrelenting intensity, and smoke from the burning buildings within the fort began to obscure the harbor. The first day of the Civil War was proving to be a longer and more devastating affair than anyone had imagined. The second day of bombardment dawned with renewed Confederate determination to reduce Fort Sumter to rubble. April 13, 1861, brought no respite for Major Anderson's beleaguered garrison as the enemy batteries resumed their relentless assault with the first light of dawn. The fort's brick walls, though designed to withstand naval bombardment, were beginning to show serious signs of structural damage. After nearly 24 hours of continuous pounding throughout the night, Anderson's men had worked desperately to repair what damage they could and redistribute their dwindling ammunition supplies. The garrison's situation had become increasingly precarious as Confederate hot-shot cannonballs heated red-hot in furnaces began to find their mark. These incendiary projectiles were specifically designed to start fires, and several had already ignited the fort's wooden barracks and other interior structures. The most serious threat came from the Confederate batteries on Cummings Point, where Colonel Ripley's gunners had achieved devastating accuracy with their rifled cannons. These modern weapons could punch through the fort's masonry walls at ranges that had previously been considered safe. The constant hammering had opened several breaches in the fort's seaward face, and chunks of brick and mortar rained down on the defenders with each successive impact. Captain Doubleday later described the scene inside the fort as resembling a volcano in eruption. Smoke from the burning buildings mixed with dust from the pulverized masonry, creating an atmosphere so thick that visibility was reduced to mere yards. The garrison's water supply, stored in cisterns beneath the fort, remained intact, but their food situation was becoming critical. The men had been reduced to eating raw salt pork and hardtack. As the fires had made cooking impossible, the Confederate strategy was working exactly as General Beauregard had planned. Rather than attempting a costly direct assault on the fort's walls, he had chosen to reduce the garrison through sustained bombardment and fire. The psychological pressure on Anderson's men was enormous, as they could only respond with occasional shots while enduring a constant barrage that seemed to have no end. As documented in the Richmond Examiner during this period, Confederate morale remained high despite the fort's stubborn resistance. The bombardment had become a source of pride for the South, demonstrating their resolve and military capability to the world. Foreign observers, including British naval officers stationed in Charleston, were impressed by the precision and intensity of the Confederate artillery fire. By midday on April 13th, the situation inside Fort Sumter had become untenable. The officers' quarters were completely destroyed, the main magazine was threatened by fire, and several of the fort's guns had been knocked out of action. Most critically, the flagstaff had been shot away multiple times, and each attempt to raise it again exposed the garrison to increased danger. The Confederate gunners had also begun using a new tactic, concentrating their fire on specific sections of the fort's walls to create practical breaches. The gorge wall, facing the mainland, had been particularly hard hit, and several gaps had appeared that would allow infantry to storm the fort if the opportunity rose. Anderson realized that his position was becoming militarily hopeless, but he remained determined to defend the fort until the last possible moment. The most dramatic moment of the day came when the fort's ammunition magazine was threatened by fire. Sergeant John Carmody and several volunteers risked their lives to move barrels of gunpowder away from the flames, working in smoke so thick they could barely see their hands before their faces. Their heroic efforts prevented a catastrophic explosion that would have killed every man in the garrison. As evening approached, the Confederate bombardment showed no signs of slackening. The fort's flag had been shot down so many times that Anderson ordered it nailed to a makeshift staff, determined that the stars and stripes would continue to fly over Fort Sumter as long as a single defender remained alive. The gesture was both practical and symbolic, representing the garrison's refusal to surrender despite their increasingly desperate circumstances. The night of April 13th brought little rest for either side. The Confederate batteries continued their bombardment by the light of calcium flares, while Anderson's men fought fires and tried to maintain their defensive positions. Both sides understood that the crisis was approaching its climax, and that the dawn would likely bring either surrender or a final, desperate defense of the fort. The morning of April 14th, 1861, brought a scene of devastation that shocked even the Confederate gunners who had created it. Fort Sumter, once a proud symbol of federal authority, now resembled a smoking ruin. The barracks were completely destroyed, the officers' quarters had been reduced to rubble, and great chunks of the fort's walls lay scattered across the parade ground. Yet incredibly, through 34 hours of continuous bombardment, not a single member of the garrison had been killed. Major Anderson surveyed the damage with growing despair. The fort's magazine was still threatened by fire, their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and the structural integrity of the walls was compromised beyond repair. Most critically, the Confederate batteries had achieved such accuracy that they could prevent any effective response from the garrison. The situation had become not just militarily hopeless, but actively dangerous for his men. The Confederate bombardment had intensified during the night, with hot shot finding their mark repeatedly among the fort's remaining wooden structures. The smoke had become so thick that breathing was difficult, and several of Anderson's men had begun to show signs of smoke inhalation. The garrison's water supply, though still intact, was becoming contaminated with ash and debris from the constant explosions. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, disaster struck. The fort's flagstaff, which had been shot away and replaced multiple times, was struck by a Confederate shell and fell once again. This time, however, the flag caught fire as it fell, and the sight of the stars and stripes burning in the harbor sent shockwaves through both sides. For the Confederate observers, it appeared that the fort had finally surrendered, while Anderson's men watched in horror as their symbol of resistance was consumed by flames. The incident prompted an immediate response from Charleston, Louis Trezevant Wigfall, a former United States Senator from Texas who was now serving as a Confederate volunteer, took it upon himself to row out to Fort Sumter under a flag of truce. Wigfall, a fiery secessionist who had been among the most vocal advocates for Southern independence, was determined to personally accept the federal surrender. Wigfall's boat approached the fort through the smoke and debris, and he climbed through a damaged embrasure to confront Major Anderson directly. The encounter was tense, with both men understanding the historical significance of the moment. Wigfall demanded to know if Anderson was ready to surrender, while the major explained that the falling flag had been accidental and that no surrender had been offered. The confusion was compounded by the fact that General Beauregard had not authorized Wigfall's mission. When official Confederate representatives arrived shortly afterward, they found themselves having to sort out what terms, if any, had been discussed. The situation was unprecedented. A volunteer had potentially negotiated a surrender without proper authority, while the federal garrison remained technically in the fight. As reported in the New York Herald during this period, news of the bombardment had electrified the nation. Telegraph lines carried hourly updates of the battle to newspapers across the country, and crowds gathered outside telegraph offices waiting for the latest bulletins. The fate of Fort Sumter had become a matter of national concern, with both sides understanding that the outcome would determine the course of future events. During the negotiations that followed, Major Anderson was offered generous terms. The Confederate representatives, led by Colonel Chestnut, agreed to allow the garrison to evacuate with full military honors, taking their personal property and weapons. They would be permitted to salute their flag before lowering it, and safe passage would be provided to any destination of Anderson's choosing. The terms were more generous than Anderson had any right to expect, reflecting both Southern chivalry and a desire to avoid creating martyrs. The Confederates had achieved their objective of removing the federal garrison from Charleston Harbor, and they had no interest in unnecessarily humiliating their opponents or creating additional reasons for Northern anger. Anderson, recognizing that further resistance would serve no purpose other than to endanger his men's lives, accepted the terms. The decision was painful but practical. Fort Sumter was no longer defensible, and his garrison had performed their duty with honor. The formal surrender would take place the following day, bringing to an end the opening battle of what would become the costliest war in American history. The morning of April 15, 1861, dawned clear and bright over Charleston Harbor, a stark contrast to the smoke-filled chaos of the previous 2 days. Major Anderson had agreed to surrender Fort Sumter, but the terms negotiated with the Confederate representatives allowed for a formal ceremony that would preserve the honor of his garrison. The evacuation would take place with full military honors, including a right to salute the flag before lowering it for the final time. Preparations for the ceremony began early, with Anderson's men working to clean their uniforms and prepare their weapons for the formal surrender. Despite the devastating bombardment, the garrison had maintained their military bearing throughout the ordeal. They had fought with distinction against overwhelming odds, and their courage had earned the respect of both sides in the conflict. The ceremony itself was planned to be a solemn affair that would acknowledge the gravity of the moment, while allowing both sides to maintain their dignity. General Beauregard had agreed to provide transportation for the federal garrison, and arrangements had been made for the steamer Isabel to carry Anderson and his men to New York. The Confederate general had also agreed to allow the garrison to take their personal effects and regimental colors. As the ceremony began, the surviving members of the garrison formed up in the fort's parade ground, their uniforms torn and blackened but their bearing proud. Captain Doubleday commanded the gun crew that would fire the final salute to the flag, while Anderson personally oversaw the lowering of the stars and stripes. The moment was both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of the Fort Sumter crisis and the opening of a war that would reshape the nation. The tragedy that marred the ceremony came during the firing of the ceremonial salute. As the cannon crews prepared to fire their 50-gun salute to the flag, an accidental explosion occurred when sparks from a previous discharge ignited a pile of cartridges. Private Daniel Huff was killed instantly, becoming the first casualty of the Civil War, while Private Edward Galloway was mortally wounded and would die several days later. The accidental explosion cast a pall over the proceedings, serving as a grim reminder of the dangers that lay ahead. The ceremony continued, but the mood had changed from one of formal military courtesy to genuine sorrow. Both sides understood that the deaths of Huff and Galloway represented more than personal tragedy. They were harbingers of the massive casualties that would follow. As reported in the Charleston Mercury during this period, the Confederate forces maintained strict discipline throughout the ceremony, with many officers expressing genuine regret at the circumstances that had led to this moment. The bombardment had been conducted with remarkable restraint, aimed at forcing surrender rather than maximizing casualties, and the generous terms offered to Anderson reflected a desire to conduct the affair with honor. The lowering of the flag was performed with military precision, with Anderson himself supervising the careful folding of the stars and stripes. The flag that had flown over Fort Sumter throughout the bombardment would be carefully preserved, and Anderson would carry it with him as both a symbol of his garrison's courage and a reminder of what had been lost. The evacuation itself proceeded smoothly, with the Confederate forces maintaining their positions while the Federal garrison boarded the Isabel. As the steamer pulled away from the fort, Anderson and his men stood at the rail, watching the scene of their ordeal recede into the distance. Fort Sumter, which had been their home and fortress for months, was now in Confederate hands. The immediate aftermath of the surrender saw Charleston celebrating what they viewed as a bloodless victory. The city had demonstrated its resolve and military capability without suffering significant casualties, and the removal of the Federal garrison was seen as validation of South Carolina's decision to secede. However, the celebration was tempered by the understanding that this was likely only the beginning of a much larger conflict for the North. The surrender of Fort Sumter became a rallying cry that would unite the country behind President Lincoln's war effort. The image of the flag being lowered under fire would inspire recruitment efforts and provide the moral justification for the massive military buildup that would follow. The war that many had hoped to avoid was now inevitable. The surrender of Fort Sumter on April 15, 1861, marked the end of the opening chapter of the American Civil War, but its significance extended far beyond the immediate military outcome. The 34-hour bombardment had transformed what many hoped would be a brief political crisis into an inevitable armed conflict that would consume the nation for the next 4 years and cost over 600,000 lives. President Lincoln's response to the surrender was swift and decisive. On April 15th, the same day that Major Anderson evacuated the fort, Lincoln issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days to suppress the rebellion. The president and his advisors believed that this show of force would quickly bring the seceded states back into the Union, a massive miscalculation that reflected the general lack of understanding about the depth of Southern commitment to independence. The call for volunteers had immediate and dramatic consequences across the country. In the North, recruitment offices were swamped with eager volunteers, many of whom feared the war would end before they could participate. Young men from farms and factories rushed to enlist, driven by a combination of patriotism, adventure-seeking, and genuine belief that they were defending the Union against rebellion. The response was so overwhelming that many volunteers had to be turned away. In the South, Lincoln's proclamation was viewed as a declaration of war against the seceded states. Virginia, which had been reluctant to leave the Union, voted to secede. On April 17th, just 2 days after the surrender of Fort Sumter, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas would follow in the coming weeks, bringing the total number of Confederate states to 11 and ensuring that the conflict would be far larger and more destructive than anyone had imagined. The bombardment itself had revealed important military lessons. that would influence the conduct of the war. The effectiveness of rifled artillery against masonry fortifications demonstrated that traditional coastal defenses were obsolete, while the accuracy achieved by the Confederate gunners showed the importance of proper training and preparation. The restraint shown by both sides during the bombardment would not be maintained. As the conflict escalated, General Beauregard's reputation was made by the successful reduction of Fort Sumter, and he would go on to command Confederate forces at the First Battle of Bull Run just 3 months later. His careful planning and execution of the Charleston bombardment established him as one of the Confederacy's most capable military leaders, though his relationship with President Jefferson Davis would later become strained. Major Anderson became a hero in the North, celebrated for his courage and determination in defending the fort against overwhelming odds. He was promoted to brigadier general and given command of the Department of Kentucky, though his health had been damaged by the stress of the Fort Sumter crisis. Ironically, Anderson would return to Charleston in April 1865, exactly 4 years after the surrender, to raise the same flag over Fort Sumter that he had been forced to lower. The political consequences of Fort Sumter were equally significant. The bombardment unified Northern opinion behind the war effort in a way that no other event could have accomplished. The image of the American flag being fired upon by rebel forces provided the moral justification that Lincoln needed to prosecute the war with full national support. The president's careful handling of the crisis, ensuring that the Confederates fired the first shot, proved to be a masterful political stroke. As documented in the Atlantic Monthly during this period, the Fort Sumter crisis had transformed American public opinion about the nature of the Union. What had been viewed as a voluntary association of states was now seen as an indissoluble bond that could only be maintained through force of arms. The bombardment had settled the question of whether states could peacefully secede from the Union. The answer was a resounding no. The fort itself would remain in Confederate hands for nearly 4 years, serving as a symbol of Southern resistance and a reminder of the conflict's origins. Federal forces would attempt to recapture it multiple times, resulting in some of the war's most intense bombardments. When Charleston finally fell in February 1865, Fort Sumter was little more than a pile of rubble, its walls reduced to a fraction of their original height. The legacy of Fort Sumter extends beyond its military significance to encompass the broader themes of American democracy and national unity. The crisis demonstrated both the fragility and the resilience of the American system, showing how quickly political disagreements could escalate into armed conflict, while also revealing the nation's capacity for self-renewal through struggle and sacrifice. The shots fired in Charleston Harbor on April 12, 1861, began not just a war, but a process of national transformation that would ultimately create a more perfect Union.